The night was calm, and the city lights shimmered faintly in the distance. The streets were not too crowded. Only a few cars passed by, and most shops were already closed. An elderly woman drove her car steadily down the road, her hands resting gently on the steering wheel. She was dressed simply, wearing a plain dark coat and a scarf around her neck. There was nothing about her appearance that would hint at her powerful position in society. To anyone watching, she looked like an ordinary woman returning home after a long day. She had attended a formal event earlier that evening, one that honored her years of service in the legal field. The gathering had been filled with colleagues, lawyers, and respected figures who admired her wisdom and her strong sense of justice. Yet she left the event quietly, without calling much attention to herself. She preferred peace and silence over loud celebration. Driving home in her modest car was her way of winding down, a chance to reflect on the day. As she passed through a quiet neighborhood, a pair of bright headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. The car behind her drew closer, almost uncomfortably close. Within moments, red and blue lights began to flash. A police car was signaling her to pull over. Calmly, she guided her car to the side of the road, switched on the hazard lights, and waited. She had done nothing wrong, but she knew from experience that sometimes doing nothing wrong was not enough to avoid suspicion. The police officer stepped out of his car and walked toward her. He was young, tall, and carried himself with a sense of authority that seemed to border on arrogance. His face was stern, and his tone carried no warmth when he called out to her. She rolled down her window politely, her expression calm and collected. The officer began asking questions in a sharp voice, his words sounding more like accusations than simple inquiries. He asked where she was going, why she was driving at that hour, and even made a remark about the neighborhood she was in. His eyes scanned the car quickly, as if searching for something to justify the stop. The elderly woman listened quietly, choosing not to interrupt. Her years of experience in the courtroom had taught her the value of patience even in the face of unfair treatment. She answered his questions politely, her voice steady and respectful. Yet, it was clear that the officer did not believe her words carried much weight. He leaned slightly closer, shining his flashlight inside the car, and asked for her license and registration. She reached for her purse slowly and carefully, making sure her movements were clear. She handed him the documents without hesitation. As he looked them over, he frowned, as if searching for a mistake or an excuse to prolong the encounter. The air between them grew tense. The officer spoke in a tone that suggested he believed he had full control over the situation. His words carried an edge, as though he expected her to stumble, to make an error that would allow him to exert more power. But the woman remained calm, her steady gaze showing no fear. Time seemed to slow down on that quiet street. A couple of cars passed by, their drivers glancing curiously at the sight of flashing police lights. For those who looked, it was just another routine traffic stop. No one could have guessed the truth about who was sitting behind the wheel. The woman, though calm on the outside, could not help but think of how often such moments turned unjust for people like her. She had seen countless cases in her career, where individuals were treated unfairly simply because of how they looked or where they came from. She knew this encounter was not just about her, it reflected a much larger issue. The officer, however, was unaware of who he was speaking to. To him, she was just another driver, someone he thought he could intimidate. He asked more questions, his tone growing firmer, almost demanding. Still, she responded with respect, choosing her words carefully. Her calmness seemed to frustrate him, as though he expected fear or nervousness in return. In the quiet of the night, the flashing lights continued to illuminate the scene. The woman's face remained composed, her hands resting lightly in her lap as she waited. She did not argue, she did not protest, but she also did not allow herself to be disrespected. Her strength was in her composure, in her ability to remain steady even under pressure. The officer finally stepped back, holding onto her documents longer than necessary, as though trying to decide what to do next. The silence between them felt heavy, but the woman did not flinch. She had faced far greater challenges in her life, in courtrooms filled with powerful people, in debates that shaped laws and touched millions of lives. This moment, though unpleasant, was one more test of patience. The street was still, the night air cool, and the distant sound of crickets filled the background. The world outside knew nothing of the small drama playing out on the roadside. The officer stood tall, convinced he was in control, while the elderly woman sat quietly in her car, knowing a truth he could not yet imagine. This encounter was far from over, but even in that first moment, something about her quiet strength hinted that the story would not end the way the officer expected. The officer stood there with her license and registration in his hand, tapping them lightly against his palm as if deciding what else he could question her about. His expression showed irritation, as though her calmness unsettled him. He had expected nervousness, excuses, or perhaps hesitation, but instead he was faced with an elderly woman who answered politely and carried herself with quiet dignity. He leaned forward again, his flashlight beam shining across the dashboard and the small bag that rested on the passenger seat. "Why are you out here at this time of night?" he asked sharply. "Most people don't drive through this neighborhood unless they have some business here." His tone suggested that he found her presence unusual, almost suspicious. She looked at him with steady eyes, her voice calm as she replied, "I am simply on my way home." She gave no additional explanation. She knew she did not owe long answers to satisfy his curiosity. The officer frowned at her short reply. He shifted his stance, crossing his arms as though trying to assert his authority further. "You know it's dangerous out here at night. People get into trouble on these roads," he said, his words carrying an undertone that suggested she should not be there at all. The woman nodded slowly, but said nothing more. Silence hung between them, broken only by the occasional sound of a car passing by in the distance. The officer seemed to grow restless, perhaps frustrated that he had not found anything wrong. He began asking questions about her car, where she had bought it, how long she had owned it, and whether it was insured. Each question was asked in a tone that suggested he was searching for flaws, yet her calm answers gave him nothing to hold on to. The situation, however, began to draw the attention of people nearby. A man walking his dog slowed down to glance at the scene. A couple driving past turned their heads as they saw the flashing lights reflecting against the woman's car. Though no one stopped, curiosity hung in the air. The sight of an elderly woman sitting quietly in her car while a young officer questioned her created an image that was hard to ignore. The woman remained composed, her hands resting gently on the steering wheel when she was not holding out documents. She had spent a lifetime understanding how power could be used and misused. She knew this officer believed the badge on his chest gave him control. But she also knew real authority did not come from force. It came from wisdom, fairness, and respect. The officer seemed unwilling to let the moment end. He asked her to step out of the car. She looked at him for a moment, her face showing no fear, and then carefully opened the door. She moved with the quiet grace of someone much younger, though her years were evident in the gentle lines of her face and the steady pace of her steps. She stood beside her car, the cool night air brushing against her coat while the officer looked her up and down. "Where exactly are you headed?" he asked again, as though her first answer had not been enough. "Home," she repeated softly, her voice carrying patience but also firmness. Her simplicity seemed to irritate him further. He wanted details, stories, perhaps a mistake that he could point out. But she gave him nothing but truth spoken in few words. The young officer's voice grew louder, not yet shouting, but sharp enough to make the air feel heavier. "Do you know how many people we stop around here who don't belong? Do you understand why I pulled you over?" She tilted her head slightly, meeting his eyes without raising her voice. "Do you?" she asked. Her question was not filled with anger but with quiet strength. For a moment he was caught off guard, unable to respond. The silence that followed was long, almost uncomfortable. The woman did not move, did not shift her gaze, and the officer suddenly seemed less certain of himself. Still, his pride would not allow him to back down. He turned away briefly, glancing at the other cars that passed by, then looked back at her with a forced sternness. He told her to wait while he returned to his car. She stood calmly by her vehicle, her breath steady, her eyes observing the world around her. A cool breeze moved across the street, carrying the faint scent of trees and distant smoke from a chimney. It was an ordinary night in every sense except for the small battle of wills happening on the roadside. From inside his car, the officer began typing her information into his computer, hoping to find something, an expired document, a missed payment, anything that would justify his suspicion. But her record was clean, spotless in fact. Nothing appeared that could support his assumptions. This only seemed to frustrate him more. He returned to where she stood, holding her license and registration, still unwilling to let her go. "You know," he said slowly, "sometimes people think they can hide behind polite words, but I can see through that." She smiled faintly, not out of amusement but from the deep patience she carried. "Polite words," she answered gently, "are a sign of respect. Perhaps you should value that more." Her calmness made his jaw tighten. He had wanted control, yet somehow it felt as though she was the one controlling the atmosphere. He could not shake the feeling that there was something different about her, something he could not quite place. Cars continued to pass, and now two people had stopped a little further down the road, watching quietly from the sidewalk. They could not hear the words, but they could see the picture. A young officer standing firmly with an elderly woman who showed no sign of weakness. To them it looked unusual, even unsettling. The officer seemed to realize that more eyes were on him now. His words grew harsher, though his voice stayed low enough to avoid being overheard. He spoke about rules, about authority, about the importance of obeying orders. The woman listened, but her calm expression never changed. Every second that passed revealed more of his character and more of hers. He was determined to assert himself, but she was determined to remain composed. In her stillness, she carried more power than he realized. The night dragged on, and the officer's attempts to find fault continued to fail. The woman remained steady, her responses clear, her presence unshaken. Slowly, the tension in the air began to shift, though he did not yet know why. For him, it was still about control, but for her, it was about something much larger, a truth that would soon reveal itself. This moment was not just about a traffic stop. It was about respect, fairness, and the dignity of a person who refused to be broken by arrogance. And though the officer still believed he had the upper hand, the woman knew the story was only beginning to unfold. The officer held her documents in his hand tightly, as though refusing to admit defeat. He had checked everything, searched for a mistake, and even questioned her repeatedly. But nothing gave him the excuse he seemed to be looking for. Still, his pride would not allow him to simply hand back her license and let her drive away. He cleared his throat, straightened his posture, and said, "Ma'am, I may need to take you in for questioning." The elderly woman looked at him calmly, her face unchanging, though her eyes carried a depth that unsettled him. Her voice was quiet, but each word carried strength when she replied, "If you believe that is necessary, then you should call your supervisor first." The officer blinked, clearly not expecting that response. He shifted on his feet, taken aback by the firm but gentle way she spoke. Her words were not a plea. They were a command wrapped in politeness. For the first time that night, he felt the control of the situation slipping slightly from his hands. He narrowed his eyes and said, "Why would I need to do that? I'm the officer on duty here. I don't need anyone else to handle this." His voice carried defiance, but inside, doubt had begun to creep in. Something about the woman's composure made him uneasy. The woman did not raise her voice or show anger. She simply repeated, "Please call your supervisor." Her calm insistence was unlike anything he had experienced during other traffic stops. He was used to people arguing, pleading, or showing fear. But here was a woman who stood with complete self-control, as though she knew something he did not. The silence stretched again between them, broken only by the sound of the night breeze moving through the trees. A car passed slowly, its driver turning to glance before continuing down the road. The officer glanced toward his patrol car, then back at her. A part of him wanted to ignore her request and prove he was in charge, but another part of him wondered if refusing might backfire. Finally, with visible reluctance, he muttered, "Fine, I'll call him." He walked back toward his car, his steps quick and slightly heavy, showing his frustration. Inside his vehicle, he picked up the radio and called for his supervisor. His voice was steady, but inside he felt a growing sense of unease. Why had she been so sure? Why had she not seemed nervous at all? While the officer waited, the elderly woman returned to her seat inside her car. She placed her hands gently on the steering wheel, her face calm, her breathing steady. She knew that patience was her strongest ally in that moment. She had faced far greater battles in her life than a late-night traffic stop. This young man did not know who she was, but she had no desire to humiliate him. She only wanted him to learn that respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned. Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. The flashing red and blue lights continued to reflect against the windows of nearby houses. Curtains moved slightly as people peeked out to see what was happening. To them, it was only another police stop, but curiosity made them watch. The officer stepped out of his car once more, pacing slightly as he waited for his supervisor to arrive. His face was tight, his jaw set. He told himself that he was still in control, but deep inside he could not shake the image of her steady gaze. It was not the look of an ordinary citizen caught in an uncomfortable situation. It was the look of someone who understood power on a deeper level. Finally, the sound of another police car approached. The supervisor's vehicle pulled up behind the officers, its headlights cutting through the quiet street. The young officer straightened immediately, trying to compose himself as his superior stepped out. The supervisor was an older man with years of experience written on his face. His eyes moved quickly from the officer to the woman sitting calmly in her car. The elderly woman opened her door and stepped out again, standing gracefully as though she were greeting an old acquaintance rather than facing an official. The moment the supervisor's eyes met hers, recognition flashed across his face. His stern expression softened instantly and he hurried forward. "Justice," he said respectfully, lowering his voice. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." The young officer froze in shock. The word hit him like a heavy weight. Justice. He looked between his supervisor and the elderly woman, confusion and disbelief spreading across his face. Suddenly, the confidence he had carried throughout the stop evaporated. The woman gave a small nod, her voice steady and kind. "Good evening, officer. I asked for you to be called so we could clear up this matter properly." The supervisor turned sharply toward the young officer, his eyes narrowing. "Do you realize who you've been speaking to?" he asked in a low but firm voice. The officer opened his mouth to reply, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, his thoughts scrambled. He had pulled over someone he thought was powerless, and now he stood before a judge from the nation's highest court. The young officer's pride crumbled in an instant. The arrogance that had guided his tone, his questions, and his assumptions now left him standing in silence, his face pale under the streetlight. He realized with growing dread that every harsh word he had spoken carried far greater consequences than he had imagined. The elderly woman looked at him gently, not with anger but with a kind of disappointed patience. She did not raise her voice, nor did she insult him. Instead, her silence pressed heavier on him than any lecture could. He felt smaller, as though the badge on his chest no longer carried the weight he thought it did. The supervisor cleared his throat, his tone respectful as he spoke to the woman. "Justice, I deeply apologize for this inconvenience. It should never have happened." She gave a soft nod. "Thank you. I only hope it serves as a lesson." The words were simple, but to the young officer they carried the weight of an entire courtroom judgment. He lowered his head slightly, unable to meet her eyes. For the first time that night he realized that true authority was not about flashing lights, raised voices, or the ability to intimidate. It was about character, wisdom, and the respect one commanded through integrity. The quiet street now seemed louder with the arrival of the second patrol car, but for the officer everything felt strangely still. He knew that nothing about the night would ever leave his memory. The woman he had treated with suspicion and disrespect was, in truth, one of the most respected figures in the land. The story of that roadside stop was not over yet, but already the balance of power had shifted completely. The night air carried a chill as the young officer stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of what had just been revealed pressed down on him with crushing force. The woman he had spoken to so harshly, the one he had tried to intimidate, was no ordinary citizen. She was a Supreme Court judge, a figure who had spent her life upholding justice, fairness, and the dignity of the law. He replayed every word he had spoken in his mind, each one sounding more foolish and disrespectful than the last. His throat felt tight, his palms damp, and for the first time that night he felt powerless. His badge, his flashlight, his patrol car, none of it mattered now. The supervisor, on the other hand, stood with quiet respect. He knew her well, had seen her in court, had read about her judgments in newspapers, and admired her reputation. He understood immediately the gravity of what had happened. He stepped closer to her, his voice calm but filled with apology. "Justice, please forgive this incident. It does not reflect the values we are meant to uphold." The elderly woman gave him a faint smile, her eyes soft but firm. "Thank you," she said simply. Then, turning to the young officer, she added, And you, young man, perhaps you should remember that respect is owed to every person, not just those whose titles you recognize. Her words struck deeper than any raised voice could. The young officer lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. Shame burned in his chest. He thought of how he had questioned her, how he had spoken with arrogance, how he had assumed she did not belong in the neighborhood. He wished he could turn back the clock and undo it all, but the truth was already exposed. Around them, the quiet neighborhood seemed to watch silently. Curtains shifted as residents peeked out, sensing something unusual had happened. They could not hear the words, but they saw the way the supervisor treated her with respect, the way the young officer's shoulders drooped, and the way the elderly woman stood with grace. The judge did not raise her voice, did not demand punishment, and did not show anger. Instead, she carried herself with the same dignity that had guided her for decades in the courtroom. She knew her power, but she also knew that true strength lay in choosing how to use it. This moment was not about humiliating a young officer, but about teaching him something he might never forget. The supervisor handed her documents back with both hands, as though offering them not just as papers but as a gesture of respect. "Justice, everything is in perfect order. I again apologize for the unnecessary stop." She accepted the documents gracefully and nodded. "I appreciate that, but understand, this moment is about more than me. It is about how many people are treated when no one recognizes their name or face. That is what concerns me most." Her voice was gentle, but the truth in her words carried weight. The young officer shifted uncomfortably, his pride gone, replaced by a sinking feeling of regret. He thought of all the other drivers he had pulled over, the way he had spoken to some of them, the assumptions he had made without cause. For the first time, he saw himself clearly, and the reflection was not flattering. The supervisor glanced at him sharply, silently warning that this mistake would not pass without consequences. But the judge, in her wisdom, did not seek to ruin him. Instead, she allowed the weight of the lesson to settle naturally. Sometimes, she knew, silence and dignity taught more than punishment ever could. The young officer finally gathered the courage to speak. His voice was quieter now, stripped of arrogance. "Ma'am," he said slowly, I didn't know. I spoke to you in a way I should not have. I was wrong." The judge looked at him for a long moment. In her eyes there was no anger, only a steady gaze that seemed to see through him. "It is not about knowing who I am," she said softly. "It is about knowing how you should treat every person who crosses your path. That is the real measure of your duty." Her words hung in the air, heavy yet full of meaning. The young officer swallowed hard, realizing that this night would remain with him for the rest of his life. He nodded slowly, not as a form of agreement but as a silent promise to himself that he would never forget this lesson. The supervisor, still standing by, gave a respectful bow of his head. "Justice, I will see to it that this incident is properly addressed." The woman gave a small nod. "Do what you must," she replied. "But remember, growth comes not only from punishment but also from reflection." The quiet street seemed to breathe again as the tension slowly lifted. The flashing lights still painted the scene in red and blue, but the atmosphere had shifted. What began as an attempt at intimidation had transformed into a moment of truth, a lesson in respect and dignity that no one present would ever forget. As she prepared to return to her car, the judge paused. She looked at the young officer one final time and said, "Remember this night, not for who I am, but for what you learned. Treat each person with the respect you gave me once you knew my title. That is the only way justice truly lives." With that, she turned gracefully and stepped into her vehicle. The door closed softly, the sound almost final, like the end of a verdict delivered in court. She started the engine, and for a moment the headlights illuminated the officer's troubled face. Then she drove off slowly, leaving behind silence and reflection. The young officer remained standing in the glow of the patrol lights, his thoughts heavy. The badge on his chest felt different now, not like a symbol of power, but a reminder of responsibility. The supervisor placed a hand on his shoulder, shaking his head slightly. "You have a lot to think about," he said. The officer nodded, his voice too weak to reply. Deep inside, he knew this night had changed him forever. The lesson had been delivered not with anger or punishment, but with dignity and truth. And that, he realized, was far more powerful than anything he had expected when he first stepped out of his patrol car. The street returned to its usual calm, the flashing lights fading as the police cars were turned off one by one, yet the memory of the encounter lingered in the air, invisible but undeniable, like a quiet reminder that respect is not a privilege reserved for a few. It is a right owed to all. The elderly woman drove slowly along the quiet streets, the night air cool against her face. The city was calm now, the flashing lights behind her fading into the distance, leaving only the soft hum of her car and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Her heart was steady, her mind focused not on anger or revenge but on the lessons the night had delivered. She knew that what had just happened was more than a simple traffic stop. It was a moment that carried a message about respect, fairness, and humanity. Though she was relieved the confrontation had ended without conflict, she could not ignore the weight of the young officer's behavior. His arrogance and prejudice were not rare in the world she knew. Many people assumed power, believed appearances determined worth, and treated others with disrespect without realizing the harm they caused. Tonight had been a chance, small though it may be, to remind someone that dignity is not earned by a badge or a uniform. It is owed to every individual. As she continued driving, her thoughts wandered to the officer, whose hands were likely still shaking, whose pride had been bruised, and whose understanding of justice had just begun to shift. She hoped that the lesson would stay with him, that he would carry it forward in his interactions with others, and that the memory of tonight would change him for the better. True justice, she knew, began with the way one treated others when no one was watching, or when no one recognized your name. Meanwhile, the young officer remained standing by the patrol car, his face pale under the dim streetlights. He replayed every moment in his mind, the questions he had asked, the assumptions he had made, the sharp tone of his voice, and most importantly, the calm, unshakable demeanor of the woman he had so wrongly judged. He thought of the words she had spoken, the gentle authority in her voice, and the undeniable truth in her message. Each memory carried a lesson he could not ignore. He knew he had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to see the consequences of prejudice and arrogance firsthand. It was not a lesson that could be taught in a classroom or through paperwork. It was a lesson that could only be learned through experience, and he felt its weight deeply, realizing that he would never again view his duty the same way. The supervisor had returned to his car, leaving the young officer to reflect alone. He glanced at his hands, thinking of the words he had spoken, and felt a pang of guilt. It was clear to him now that his role as a protector of the law meant more than enforcing rules. It meant showing fairness, understanding, and respect to every person he encountered, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. The memory of the judge's calm expression stayed with him. Her presence had been quiet yet powerful, gentle yet firm. She had demonstrated that true strength was not measured by force or intimidation, but by patience, dignity, and integrity. He realized that her lesson extended far beyond him. It was a reminder to all who bore responsibility for others, that respect must always come first. Back in her car, the judge reflected on the night's events as she drove home. She thought of the young officer again, wondering if he would truly remember her words, if he would internalize the meaning of respect, and if he would carry it forward in his life and career. She hoped he would, not because she sought recognition, but because she believed in the importance of teaching through example. Sometimes the smallest actions could have the greatest impact, and she trusted that this moment, though brief, might inspire change. Her thoughts then turned to the larger picture. Every day, countless people faced judgment, prejudice, and unfair treatment. Many of them were never recognized for their worth or their achievements. Tonight had been a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that titles do not always matter, and that true justice is rooted in how we treat one another, regardless of circumstances. When she finally reached her quiet neighborhood, she parked her car and stepped out, feeling the cool night air against her face. She walked slowly toward her front door, reflecting on the lessons of patience, courage, and dignity she had witnessed and demonstrated tonight. Even though the confrontation was over, the impact would continue in ways she could not see, spreading quietly, like ripples on water. The young officer, meanwhile, walked slowly back toward his car. He felt humbled, ashamed, and more aware than ever of his responsibilities. He knew he had been given a glimpse of the standards he should hold himself to, not just as a law enforcement officer, but as a human being entrusted with authority. He resolved to treat every person he met with fairness, to pause before judging, and to consider the dignity inherent in each life he encountered. The supervisor watched from a distance as the officer returned to his car, his expression unreadable, but serious. He understood that the night's events had taught the young officer a lesson he might never forget. While the legal system could issue reprimands or training, nothing replaced the understanding gained through a personal, transformative experience. And tonight that experience had arrived in an unforgettable way. In the quiet of her home, the judge finally set down her keys and removed her coat. She took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of calm reflection. The night had been challenging in unexpected ways, but it had also been a reminder of why she continued her work. Justice, fairness, and respect were not abstract concepts. They were principles she lived by and hoped others would carry forward. She thought again of the young officer, hoping that he would grow from this experience. Perhaps, she reflected, this moment would shape the way he interacted with others for the rest of his career, teaching him the importance of patience, dignity, and fairness. Perhaps he would remember her words, and in some small way, the world might be slightly better because of it. The night grew quieter, and the city seemed to settle into a peaceful rhythm. Inside her home, the judge prepared for bed, reflecting on the events with a sense of calm satisfaction. She knew that she had handled the situation with the same patience, respect, and dignity that had guided her throughout her life. And she trusted that the lessons delivered tonight would continue to echo, quietly, in the mind of the young officer and in the hearts of others who might one day hear the story. As she drifted off to sleep, she felt a quiet reassurance. True justice was not just about courts, judges, or laws. It was about the way we treat one another, the respect we show, and the courage we demonstrate in moments where appearances and assumptions could easily mislead. Tonight had been such a moment, and she had met it with grace. In the weeks that followed, the young officer often thought back to that night. Each time he remembered the calm, unwavering presence of the judge, he felt a renewed sense of responsibility. He approached his work differently, with more patience, more thoughtfulness, and a deeper understanding of what justice truly meant. The lesson had been profound, and though it had begun as an ordinary traffic stop, it had grown into a life-changing experience, and for the judge, life returned to its normal rhythm as well. Though she carried the memory of that night with quiet satisfaction, she knew that one small act of standing firm in dignity could have far-reaching consequences. She had turned a moment of injustice into a lesson, a reminder of the importance of fairness, respect, and integrity. And in doing so, she had not only taught a young officer, but had quietly reminded the world that true power lies in character, not in assumption, title, or authority alone.